Hey, Brent.
Hi there, I'm just checking in to make sure you're okay, Brent.
I think we are. Just got the recording started, Chris. Dana's online and ready to roll, so I think we're ready to begin.
Okay, perfect. Okay, I will get rid of my audio and just keep monitoring chat and stuff. Okay.
Thank you very much. That's awesome. Thanks. And we're 5 seconds away, so let's. Well, good afternoon, everybody. This is the third session in track 3. We have with us today Dana Shtun, VE3 Delta Sierra, who will be talking to us about his 50+ years in amateur radio. I've been a ham for 38 years, and I thought I was a bit of a fossil, but Dana's got me beat. And Dana's not only been a ham for a long time, but he's been very involved in the amateur radio community and the organizations that represent us. He got interested in VHF DX after first getting on 144 megahertz and making his first contact on Aurora with K2RTH in Long Island using a modified aircraft transmitter on CW. Dana then fell in with a bunch of wayward Toronto VHFers in 1971, and it was all downhill after that, including multi operations from VE3DMF's farm in Claremont as VE3ONT, and that placed the Canadians in the top 5 for the first time in the ARRL June VHF Contest, and set a new record in 1982, which stands for the pre-grid square era for Canadians. Dana is one of the founding fathers of the Radio Amateurs of Canada, having been the president of the CRRL, or the Canadian Radio Relay League. He was part of the RAC merger team and was the first vice president of our new organization. He has a long history of interest in preserving our access to spectrum, particularly above 1000 megahertz. So we're very, very fortunate to have Dana, VE3DS, with us today. Dana, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope you're all enjoying the presentations. I know I have been, and I'll just carry on here with you know, some trying to cram 53 years of amateur radio into a short presentation here. So if I miss anything, you know, please forgive me. But let me just get the screen set up here, and hopefully we can get things set up here. Okay.
Setting up a screen share for us, Dana?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay, keep getting all these reference questions here that I haven't seen before. Okay, so looks like we're okay. How's that, Brent?
Looks great.
Looks great. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So we're in business here, folks. So hang in there. So my intent of the presentation today is to kind of give a brief spin about a couple of things. And I was thinking about how amateur radio has been an influence to me over the last 50+ years. And you know, one thing that came to my mind was the personal network, the interaction between amateur radio operators and how that develops over time. So I'm going to talk about that networking thing, because I think it's very important, and it's going in my history, and I think very important to everybody going forward. If you listen to the comments from the presidents of RAC, RSGB, and ARRL, I think that message is kind of in what everybody says. And then I'm going to give a brief spin through the technology and how it's impacted us. So So it's not going to be a terribly in-depth thing, but I think some of it's important, just because it just boggles my mind that of all the things that have happened over the last 50 years. So anyway, I got interested in ham radio when I was little. Like when I was 3 years old, I stuck my fingers in an electrical socket and got zapped. My dad was an EE, electrical engineer. So some of my earliest memories were going to the Canadian General Electric Family Day in Toronto here and seeing the arcing and sparking and the transformer display that they had there. These were like high voltage transformers in a cage arcing lightning bolts. You know, when you're a little kid and you see lightning bolts in a building, it kind of sticks in your mind. And my dad had copies of the handbook around the house. So, you know, I got exposed to it probably right from the get-go, you know, kind of thing. But all that interest sort of led to SWLing in high school, and then connecting with some of the other kids at school who were interested in this kind of thing. And we had a really interesting time there, sharing information and listening on shortwave and getting QSL cards from other countries, which was pretty interesting. But also there was always this undercurrent about ham radio floating around, and some of my friends' parents knew hams, so they connected us to these people, and they connected us to the local radio club here in the West End of Toronto, which was the Skywide Amateur Radio Club. So, you know, my first visit to that club was in about 1967, and I was still too young to get a license at that time, but I was still quite interested in the whole thing and finding out what this was all about. And eventually that connection with the radio club brought me to taking the amateur radio course at Etobicoke Collegiate, which was run by Ray Hunter, VE3ONT, who is a very well-known amateur in the West End of Toronto and around the province as well. And I finally got licensed in March of 1969 as VE3DSS. So it's all predicated on connections. My dad had connections at CGE who were hams, and friends who were hams, high school friends who knew hams, and that connected us to the club, and the club led to the license. And from there, it grew. It grew out into the larger local community in Metro Toronto on ham radio. And the club people were really helpful in helping and guiding us. I mean, we were high schoolers with limited resources, so some of the guys let us actually come over and use their stations and get on the air for the first time. And, you know, it was a real nerve-wracking experience, I must admit, on CW to actually work somebody. And they also provided us with resources of used gear or advice on what to buy and what to stay away from or what to build. So the club was probably an instrumental aspect of amateur radio, and something that we really need to maintain and preserve, I think, going forward. Basic stations back in the 60s were pretty primitive in a lot of ways. A lot of them used post surplus World War II gear. My own first receiver was this R1155 here. And the cool thing with this was it had a tuning eye just to the right of the upper right of the dial there. And it was tied into the AGC circuit, so it would wink with the CW. And it was it was a great first step in amateur radio. And these things were all over the place. You could go down on Yonge Street to the radio stores at that time and find piles of them all over the place. And we were fortunate too to have Heathkit in Mississauga, and a lot of the young guys were able to get Heathkit gear, like the DX60 and the VFO and things like that. So there was a tremendous amount of opportunity there, and a lot of guys built their own stuff too. So it was a great learning experience all the way around. And at the Skywide Club, a lot of the guys were DXers. So we go to meetings and listen to them talking about working Market Reef or some exotic island out in the Indian Ocean. And that got the old antenna up, like, oh yeah, geez, I'd love to do that too. So during a family trip to Florida, I coerced, I guess that's probably a good word, coerced my dad to take me to downtown Miami, into a not very nice area, to a place called Gotham Antennas, which used to advertise in QST. And I got the tour of the place and picked up a 2-element quad and brought it back on the roof of the car. And in retrospect, that antenna really was an interesting design, very basic, but it certainly did the job. Once I got it up on the tower, and I worked CW for 6 months, and then got my 10-meter endorsement, going down to the DOT office on St. Clair and presenting my log to the radio inspector, and they're going through it, making sure I've been active, and granting me permission to get on 10-meter phone, which at that time was AM for me. And I was chasing DX on 6-meter on HF and doing some contesting as well, and field day with the club, and connecting with the other clubs when they had their auctions and things like that, and getting to know people. So this network was expanding, and that network expanded and expanded over time. And here's a shot of a bunch of us, and a bunch of us high schoolers in the 1971 field day. So there we are with some borrowed equipment again, and setting up a tent, antennas, and getting out there and operating and having a great time. So that was great. And that went on for a couple of years. And then I got interested. I'd always been interested in VHF, because I used to do a little bit of TV DXing. So I was on 2-meter AM with a borrowed Heathkit tour, and connected up again with some of the local guys on 2 meters, who then told me about all the, like, there were a whole bunch of them on AM on 2 meters. And then they were always grumbling about these sidebanders. And it was like, what is that? And so one thing led to another, and I actually found out who these sidebanders were, and got connected to another group of guys in Toronto on VHF who were running single sideband and CW. And it was like, oh, you can do that up here? Well, one thing led to another, and I wound up, as Brent mentioned, getting on 2-meter CW and actually working. One of my first DX contacts was on Aurora, and from there, I connected through the group of us here in Toronto. We connected with the guys across the lake in Rochester, New York. And the Rochester VHF group was a big going concern at that time, and still is today. And from there to the East Coast VHF group, and I connected to the Central States VHF group. And all these connections kept multiplying. And then some of the guys were talking about Dayton and Hamfest in the States, and it's like, oh yeah, okay. So then we were making trips to the US to attend some of these functions. So the networks grew even more, and sort of our view of the world grew more and more as well as time went on. And on the VHF side of things, we then, I'd experienced Aurora contacts and tried meteor scatter on 2 meters, and then we heard talk about moonbounce, and some of the early efforts by WA6LET in California using the Stanford dish. One of the locals here, Dennis V3ASO, was set up to contact the LET group on 2 meters, which was pretty amazing to hear signals coming back from the moon on 2 meters. And again, that grew and grew. It's like, I know a guy, I know a couple of other guys, and those 2 guys know more guys. So the whole VHF side of things just grew exponentially. So it's all these networking connections, and that's the sort of the social side of things at ham radio. Yes, there's the technology side. We'll talk about that later, but the key thing with this is the social networking that goes on with the amateur community, and it is very important, I think, not only for individual amateurs, but for us as a group. As you can see with Radio Amateurs of Canada, there's that networking of Canadian amateurs, and then with networking globally through IARU, all the various societies network with each other. And that's one of the ways that we've been able to share what we know, expand our horizons, and develop and protect what we have. But it has another aspect too, because you never know when you're going to run into a ham. So it could be a university administrator, or a professor. Personally speaking, I got my first summer job through a ham at the Skywide Club, and I think I got my first full-time job too because of my amateur radio hobby. And certainly from there, I connected to a whole network of amateur radio operators within IBM when I joined, because they had a tremendous club, and they still do, worldwide. So it's like an introduction. It's like like we have something in common. Maybe we work in different areas. Maybe we have different experiences in life, but it's always that commonality that draws us together. For instance, I knew a guy who knew a guy in Puerto Rico, so I got connected to Angel WP3R down there, and next thing I know, I had arranged a tour of the big dish down there. But it goes deeper than that too. I mean, in times of emergency or in war, society calls on people with skills to help with social issues, with life safety issues. For instance, here in Toronto, Hurricane Hazel was one of the first. World War II was another one where the country called on experienced hams and the network of hams to help out. The current situation in Ukraine is another example. So it just multiplies. The networking just multiplies. And here's a few shots of some of the guys. I mean, I'm talking a lot about connections here, but it's groups. It's a bunch. It's sort of sharing experiences. So we've got the VE3ONT group up at the Algonquin Radio Observatory on the right side there. Some of the ONT guys here back in 1982, and the Ontario VHF Association meetings, and some contesting as well. So we're all drawn together in groups where we're sharing common experiences and doing things in the hobby that we're all working together on, which is a really great aspect of amateur radio. And of course, you know a guy, a connection, somebody somewhere that can point you in the right direction. So here's a picture of Angel WP3R showing me the surface of the Arecibo dish and the control room on the right side, and there's a shot of yours truly at W1AW. So it all just demonstrates how we are all connected worldwide in this hobby, which is just fabulous. So that's the social side. The social side is I think one of the most important things to keep the hobby alive, to keep everybody active and connected and working to keep amateur radio in the forefront. But it's also the evolution of technology. And the technology has changed so much over the last 50 years. I just have I can't even begin to talk about how things have changed. When I got my license, equipment was pretty basic. There were still pretty much tube type gear, ruled the waves for the most part, and single sideband was just sort of taking off and displacing AM, but it was still there was still an awful lot of AM gear around, and some of the gear had options to generate single sideband externally with an additional phasing unit that could be added to an AM transmitter to turn it into a single sideband unit. And then the innovation carried on. Heathkit came out with their SB series and HW series of radios. Drake came out with their B line, and Collins had the S line, and of separate transmitters and receivers and transmitters that could be linked together to turn separate receivers and transmitters into sort of quasi transceivers. And so it went, in the 60s and then into the 70s. Gradually, the big three from Japan started showing up here in North America. Yaesu, Trio Kenwood, and ICOM receivers started to appear. So our opportunities for equipment grew rapidly over that period of time. And then along with that came the innovation of solid state technology. A lot of the receivers that were tube type in the 60s evolved into solid state receivers, and the transceivers would come out with came out from Yaesu and the others with all solid state except for the final amplifier, in essence. And then from there, things went totally solid state. So you can see the progression of gradually phasing out the vacuum tube technology and moving into the solid state side of things. So here's some prime examples of some of the gear. The Drake equipment, and Collins and Heathkit, and the Signal One in the center here, which was one of the state-of-the-art transceivers in the late 80s. So you can see that the equipment was large and took up a lot of space, but it certainly was a lot more portable and functional than the earlier generations of equipment. And I want to thank my good friend Peter V7PS for providing the pictures of the Drake stuff and the Collins stuff from his collection. So it's good to have all this wonderful stuff preserved for posterity. So that's on HF. And then on VHF, to begin with, there wasn't a lot of gear on VHF. Heathkit had the tour and some other AM gear. A lot of the stuff used in the 50s and 60s was converted World War II aircraft gear. And then gradually companies like Collins and Drake and Hallicrafters came out with transverters, which are transmit receive converters that would take your HF signal and convert them up to VHF. So not only could you receive 2 meters on your 28 meg radio, but you could transmit out on 2 meters using your 28 meg transmitter. And then along the same line, the FM gear, Trio, Kenwood, ICOM, and Yaesu were coming out with all kinds of interesting radios in Japan to feed the Japanese market, and that stuff started to trickle over here as well. And GE and Motorola had tons of surplus FM gear that amateurs were pretty swift to pick up and convert to 2 meters. And around that time too, in the late 60s, the repeater systems started to pop up as well. So there was a sort of a divide between the FM and the single sideband operations at that time too, as the technology grew. So people would network to get their repeater group going, and a lot of clubs had their own repeaters, and it continued to mushroom over time. A lot of the VHF activity generated or created small craft businesses who were producing small quantities of specific equipment to feed the market. Germany, Sweden, and Britain were some of the keys in Europe, and a lot of that European gear made its way over to North America too. And just a couple of examples: SSB electronics and microwave modules, and represented sort of the German side of things and the British side of things in terms of providing transverters and amplifiers and other gear. And then over time too, in the late 60s, early 70s, into the later part of the 1970s, ICOM, Yaesu, and Kenwood started coming out with dedicated multi-mode radios, which really fed that market as well. As well as on the antenna side of things, Cushcraft and High Gain and Telrex were all supporting VHF and UHF operations. Some of the antennas worked and some of them didn't, but they were still pushing the market there. And this is just a shot of how my home station has developed over the period of time here. You can see on the left, probably a shot of my station in 1976 with an old Heathkit HX30 on 6 meters here, big 10 watts of single sideband, and HF station with an R4B and an SB401 transmitter. And in the middle picture there, you can see it's all gone. I went all ICOM at that in the intervening years. You can see some black boxes in the middle there. Those are all SSB electronics transverters. So I had everything set up there on 6 meters, 2 meters, 222, or 220, and 432. And today's station is a little more little more exotic with L-Craft K3 and L-Craft K4, and some new multi-band VHF gear from Q5 Signal. So the state of the art on technology is, I think, one of the things that's been driving all the move from vacuum tubes down to solid state is it shrunk all the gear down. So so in the middle here, I've just lined up a number of different generations of VHF receivers for you to look at here, and at the top there is an old 1950s version tape tone 2 meter receive converter, and a solid state one here from the 70s, and SSB microwave modules, a receiver from the late 80s. And then these bottom two are SDRs. It's the Hack RF1, which is actually a transceiver. So it covers HF through 6 gigahertz. And you can run any mode you want on it. I've used it to produce TV signals. It'll work SSB, it'll work CW, it'll work anything you can generate with a computer, it'll reproduce it. And it's a transceiver, and it's the size of your hand. And of course, this is the SDR Play. It's a very well-made receiver that works up to 2 gigahertz. And the stuff just keeps coming. On the right side is a 1.8 to 54 megahertz kilowatt amplifier from WA6PQL or W6PQL, and it's in a little box, probably about 12 inches by 8 inches by 10 inches. And it's all solid state, no high voltage. You don't have to worry about getting zapped, and it's instant on, and away you go. So the shrinking continues, and it's one of the good and the bad of technology, because of course, as the shrinking happens, the stuff gets smaller inside and gets harder to work on. So where the vacuum tube stuff was easy to work on, the more modern stuff is a little bit of a challenge to service. But I think that that trend will continue over time. So I don't see that stopping. And here's a shot of my current sort of rack of transverters covering 2 meters, 222, 432, 902, and 1296. And this is on the left is the replacement for that whole pile of iron and aluminum and cabling. And it's a little box about 10 inches by 10 inches, which has all the bands right there, and integrates with the K4, and away you go. So this is where it's all going, I guess, and the trend will continue in that respect. On the antenna side as well, antennas continue to develop. We've got big antennas and little antennas and everything in between. Got folding antennas for moonbounce that you can literally fold up and carry under your arm and set up a moonbounce station wherever you want. Or if you really want to go big, you can get a crane and a tower and hoist up some big antennas. And these are some shots of our VE3ONT operations back in the 70s here up at VE3DMF's farm in Claremont, and at Bob V3KZ's place here on the left, and our operation at the Algonquin Radio Observatory in Algonquin Park with the 50-meter dish. So I must say we've kind of experienced an awful lot of interesting things with our friends and associates, and shared a lot of fascinating experiences, and reveled in that technology. So computers, now computers and antennas, computers have had a whole huge influence over the hobby since I got on. And you know, one of the things that really they provided was a tool to actually design antennas. And in the 60s, a lot of the antenna designs were kind of trial and error. You'd put a design together, take it out on an antenna range and test it, and then go back to the drawing board and change this and change that. And it was a bit of a black art, and people were making all kinds of outlandish gain claims and performance claims. And you know, you'd buy the antenna, take it home, put it up, and it didn't work. And then what do? You know, you go back to the manufacturer and say, hey, like, you guys said it was this. And it's, yeah, well, you know, we thought it did, you know. So you had no real recourse. And so come along 1970s, there had been a lot of work done in professional circles to try and quantify and standards, set some standards for antenna design. And the National Bureau of Standards came out with a publication on antenna design, which was a great step in that direction. And there was more work done in the 80s with W2PV and URI V3BMV. One of my local buddies here on it, building antennas, building them to last, and trying to design and isolate all the parameters that would make the antennas repeatable, so that anybody could build them. And of course, it was still sort of a black art at that time. And then along came some computer-based applications of finite element analysis tools. And an article appeared in IEEE about a 6-element Yagi designed by a computer, which was kind of an eye-opener. And more work was done by guys on the East Coast, W1GXT and Company, the East Coast VHF Group, Lionel V7BQH, DL6WU, K1FO, all were involved in coming out with antenna designs that hams could reproduce. And by golly, like, a lot of that work has led to some standard designs that everybody can take the measurements that were provided and go to the local aluminum store and pick up the aluminum you need and build yourself an antenna that actually works the way they claim it does. On the microwave side of things, the loop Yagi came into existence as well in the UK. And that antenna has taken over on the bands above 900 megahertz, providing support for repeatable antenna designs that anybody can build and use on those frequencies. And computer programs, EasyNet, Yo and AO, all appeared in the 90s, and were instrumental in providing the tools down to the amateur community as well. So suddenly you could design your own antennas in the basement, and then share those concepts with your friends. So it became less of a black art and much more of a science. And a lot of it was driven by radio amateurs. So, you know, that's something that we need to keep in mind. And of course, today, the LFA design from G0KSC is proven to provide a huge increase in 6-meter operation, and on UHF as well for moonbounce, creating low noise antennas with really repeatable patterns that work very, very well. On the operating award side of things too, things have mushroomed. When I got my license, we had the DXCC, and there wasn't much else really out there to go after. Worked All States Award, but on HF that was fine, but on VHF there wasn't a lot because we had provinces here in Canada and states in the US, and our provinces are huge. So, you know, and one of the problems we found, like in contesting, was on VHF was you could be in Windsor and provide a contact for Ontario, and if you were in Toronto, you'd still be providing a contact for Ontario. So what we were faced with was a lot of the Americans, you know, they would work one station, whoever they could, in Ontario, and then, okay, well, we checked that grid, that contact, that contact off for a contact, and turn the antennas back to the south, trying to work other states. But along came the grid square concept, which was brought over from Europe, and that changed things, because suddenly Ontario, being so big, was made up of a whole huge number of grid squares. So suddenly, if you were in Thunder Bay, you were in a rare grid square, so you were considered DX. So here's just an example here of grid square contacts I've made on 6 meters around the world. And that's really driven activity there. And of course, the Canada Award has been available through RAC, and that took a little bit of work to get that, but we were able to do that on 6 meters as well. And of course, the XCC, which is something that's been driving me for the last 50 years almost. So we just made 150 countries on 6 meters here a few weeks ago. So I've kind of reached my goal in doing that on 6 meters, which I had never expected to be able to do when I started this 50 years ago. But that's a whole different story in itself, and there's a lot of IARU influence there, and societies working together to expand 6 meter operation globally. And it's a perfect example of what hams can do to influence their administrations, and sharing spectrum in a lot of places in Europe, for instance, where TV operations were still co-located in the 6 meter band. But again, that's a whole different story, but it's a very compelling story as well. And, you know, over time, we've learned an awful lot about operating modes and propagation. When I first got on, we really didn't know all the ins and outs of what the sun and the earth, the interaction between the sun and the earth was on HF propagation. We kind of had some studies done during cycle 19 in 1958 to try and understand the relationship of the ionosphere and how it interacts with the sun and the earth. But that continued onwards. And of course, computers and satellites had a huge influence in that time frame, starting in the 60s, with the push to send astronauts into space, and early studies to develop a space station, sending astronauts to the moon. All that stuff drove studies of the ionosphere and the earth. And it created some havoc as well on HF with the over-the-horizon radar systems on HF, like the Russian woodpecker or the, well, I guess it wasn't, it was the Soviet woodpecker in the 1980s. And on 6 meters, as I mentioned, you know, it opened up, the whole 6 meter band opened up. When I got on, there was only one station in Europe that had a license, and that was EI2W. Harry in Ireland was the only one that was active legally in Europe. And everything else, any other stations we worked over there were crossband 28 to 50 megahertz. So we would transmit on 6 meters and then listen to people calling us back on 28 megs. Which was kind of neat because you could have a full duplex conversation. You could actually hear yourself in the speaker coming back on 28 megs. And over time too, some of the we've in Europe, we've got additional bands at 70 megs and 40 megahertz, the 8 meter band. And hopefully maybe some of those bands will bleed over to region 2 eventually, but time will tell. Meteor scatter and moonbounce were all influenced by computer technology too, and I really can't get into all that stuff, but just to comment that, for instance, Q65 is now sort of the main mode used on EME. On the microwave side of things, over the last 50 years, the spectrum has become much more accessible to amateurs. Back in the 60s, it was very difficult to get anything to work properly above 432. Yeah, but with the development of transverters and amplifiers and feed systems and groups like the Central States VHF group and groups in California and Europe and the East Coast and all getting together and sharing information, gradually a lot of these issues were put to bed, and equipment suddenly became much more readily available for microwave operations. And today, recently, a few weeks ago, Barry VE4MA set an overland record on 10 gigahertz of 1,226 kilometers with N0OY on tropo. And that distance would have been unheard of 10 years ago. So that just the change in technology has been so rapid and significant, and it's continuing. So we're actually getting more able to get on 10 gigahertz. And a lot of people are saying, well, 10 gigs is the new 2 meters. So, keep that in mind, especially when people start talking about, threats to our bands and sharing our bands and things like that. You have to justify our use. I think that justification will continue. And I think ICOM's done a real service to us by providing radios now that will work on 2.4 and 5.7 gigahertz out of the box, which is just great. And of course, I think there was some talk by Rick about information and providing ARRL providing information out to the amateur community, and it sure has grown because when I got on, it was all hand printed newsletters and publications and magazines, and now it's all Google and the internet. So a lot of this stuff, the information there, the resource information is now readily available at the click of a button to anybody, which is great. So just to sum up, amateur radio over the last 50 years has really changed a lot on the technological side, and I think that will continue to evolve over the next 50 years. On the social side, over the last 100 years, that networking between amateur radio operators globally, us radio geeks, has kept the hobby alive and viable. And I think that is a critical thing that we really have to nurture. So the social interaction side of things is something that drives us as human beings, and I think it drives amateur radio as well. So so think forward and take pride in your hobby and share it with everybody that you can, and I think it'll be good news for everybody going forward. So that's it for me, and Let me just stop sharing here, and I appreciate your time today, and look forward to seeing you on the air.
That's awesome, Dana. Thank you so much. Very well done, and a lot of it is memorable to me because I've been around for almost, well, not quite that long, but a lot of those descriptions that you gave us. And also we have congratulations from Alan Griffin, who said great job. And he reminded our viewers today, who are particularly members of RAC, that the latest issue of 6 meters and down, which is your column in TCA, October 2022, has an account of Barry's exploits. So
Yep.
I just got the magazine on Friday. I haven't had a chance to look at it yet, but I plan to.
And just as an aside, Barry did it again. The two guys did it again. So it's two instances on 10 gigahertz of extremely long distance communication. So who knows what's going to happen next year?
You never know.
Yep.
And we know it'll get better. And I'm glad you referred to those new ICOM radios. I saw the mystery box, the plexiglass box with this stuff inside at Dayton.
Yep. Yep.
And there was lots of guessing as to what it was, but nice to know what it actually is. And it sounds like it's pretty cool.
Yeah, it is. It is.
Very good. Thanks a lot, Dana. I don't see any other questions coming in, but if there are, we could probably have a minute or two. However, if there are no further questions, we probably all need a bit of a comfort break before the annual general meeting gets underway at the top of the hour. So Trish mentioned that she sent out a further follow-up email to everybody who's registered so that they can re-grab the link to the main meeting that comes up at the top of the hour, wherever that may be in your location, or the bottom of the hour if you're watching from Newfoundland. I should make that note. Anyhow, thanks a lot, Dana. It was great to see you in person for a change. I know we worked a bit and for several times long ago, but nice to see you there. And you're clearly at the cutting edge of this, and I'll be very interested to see future columns and future developments in the tighter, lower wavelengths.
You bet. Yeah.
Right.
Thanks, Brent. Thanks for hosting.
Thanks again. I'll stop the recording now.